Our second speaker has spent over 40 years shaping India's strategic defense and foreign policy footprint, often in places that require both nerves of steel and the patience of a monk. From being India's ambassador to Japan and Mexico, to leading our consulates in Shanghai and Sydney, he's been at the table for some of the most complex negotiations with China and beyond. And if that wasn't enough, he speaks 9 languages, which means he can politely tell you you're wrong in more ways than most of us can count. Please welcome the man steering India's premier defense think tank, Ambassador Sujan R. Chinoy. Our moderator for the evening, Mr. Dinesh Kumar. May we please have him on the stage.
Right, thank you very much. First of all, a very warm evening to all of you, a bit rainy and drizzly. I would like to make a couple of observations and remarks before we start this thing. You see, I think the Indian diplomats have probably one of the most difficult job really to do, because we live in a neighborhood which has not at all been pleasant. At best, it's been a no war, no peace situation, with some phases of maybe some pleasantness. But largely, it's been a very challenging neighborhood and a very, very challenging world. Now, we have our diplomats posted all over the world, of course, but to be posted and to be heading missions as ambassadors or high commissioners to countries like Pakistan, China, Japan, all our immediate neighboring countries, to the US, Israel, are very challenging assignments. And you really have to be amongst the better of the best in order to get those postings. I mean, it's not just about getting them. I mean, you really have to be on the top. So we are really very honored and privileged to have 2 such officers of the Foreign Service who have had them, but for the country for that matter. So you're looking at the 2 of our finest diplomats, and it's really an honor and a privilege to have you both, sir. I would like to start with you, Ambassador Chinoy, and ask you about if you could kind of decode what's going on between India and the US. 25 years of a fairly decent relationship, unprecedented in Indo-US relations in the last 78 years or whatever. And then suddenly we have this major change taking place over barely 3 months. Tariffs, all kinds of statements, remarks, not looking good at all. So what now, and can the situation be salvaged?
Look, firstly, let me thank the Ludhiana Management Association, Mrs. Kang in particular, and all of you for this great invitation and opportunity to be with you this evening in this wonderful city. And also to express great delight in being alongside my friend, Ambassador Ajay Bisaria, but also Mr. Dinesh Kumar, because not many of you may know that I've known this gentleman, this erudite gentleman for esteemed father, late father was my colleague in the embassy. So I've known him virtually all my life, and it's therefore a particular pleasure to be here this evening. As far as the United States is concerned, you're all aware that the India-US relationship is all important. It's always been very important, regardless of the nature of the relationship. When you look back in the past, there was a period when we spoke of India and the US being estranged democracies. So, and estranged we were, because when we achieved independence, India under Pandit Nehru had opted for strategic autonomy of a certain type, which was clearly in those days, characterized by our non-aligned status and the fact that India didn't want to be in any camp during the Cold War. But then India was not a very big economy, and we needed even help with regard to food grains at a point of time in the NITO or CIETO, which were the two, the Philippines Pact and the Baghdad Pact, as they were called, and we had stayed away from that. So we were seen then as a country that was not really doing the bidding of the West. And the West had a certain control over India as well in terms of the UN Security Council playing up issues related to the subcontinent. So we've been through tough times. We went through tougher times in 1965 when the United States sanctioned both India and Pakistan. In 1971, it was a blatant, stand that the U.S. took with Pakistan, and the USS Enterprise, as you know, steamed into the Bay of Bengal. The Americans, Nixon and Kissinger, had even tried to convince Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, particularly through Zhou Enlai, that the United States should actually, sit aside and not do anything if China were to attack India or open a second front. The Chinese were wise enough not to do that. We've been through a lot, actually. 1974, sanctioned again, and I wouldn't call it a cul-de-sac. It's not. There should be a way out of this current, difficult situation. It appears to be like an impasse, but I don't think it is a totally hopeless situation. It's related to partly the nature of the leadership in the United States today, to do with things like his desire, the president's desire for certain acclaim as a peacemaker. There are other substantive issues to do with trade, particularly with regard to some vulnerable sectors of our economy. And there could be a slew of other issues as well. But I do believe that this is an extraordinarily important relationship. US defense equipment is valuable. It is of great use to India. It adds an edge to our defense capabilities, particularly the large expeditionary aircraft that we've acquired, the C-130, the C-17. Even helicopters like the Chinook are very important for our lift capabilities in what you call the lateral terminal, border roads reaching up to our border posts. And they were particularly useful in the aftermath of the bloodletting at Galwan. So this relationship, based on a certain kind of technological convergence, a convergence about our part of the paradigm, nothing fundamentally has shifted at the functional level, though there is a lot of friction in the media as well, and when pronouncements have been made at multiple levels, which gives the kind of impression that the relationship has come completely apart. But if you look at the politics of Washington, particularly Mr. Trump himself, you cannot put it past him to do a volte-face on this as well. He has done a volte-face on virtually everything else. He has most recently done a volte-face on Russia by going after Putin after initially mollycoddling him. Then he has done a volte-face with China after initially going after China, but now kind of reaching out to China. So this may be a phase in my view, but we should keep up the engagement and the efforts the contacts and keep the decibel level low at both ends. And that's where I would end my... could I just chip in on,
Yes, yes.
on that before you pose a question about some other part of the world? As far as Operation Sindoor is concerned, I was in fact a member of one of the all-party delegations that was sent out, and it is something that conveys very clearly to Pakistan that any future terrorist attack will come at a very high cost. Having said that, the bit about ambiguity is right, because ambiguity is an advantage, and there is no set method by which you can decide what exactly will be the trigger point for the ongoing Operation Sindoor to restart itself. It is currently ongoing in that broad sense, but the trigger point should not be identified, because once you do that, you're revealing your thought process. So it will entirely depend on the nature of the attack, the kind of casualties that take place, the nature of the evidence available, and it should necessarily take place, the retaliation, at a time and place of our choosing. Government would consult the armed forces and then take action. It does not have to be a Pavlovian response that they've done something and therefore we must immediately retaliate in a certain manner. There is also the bit about what next. The likelihood of another terrorist attack is very high, for the simple reason that Pakistan is currently a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, and it will remain so until the end of next year. And it obviously looks to agitating this issue at the international level, not just in Washington, but in capitals all over the world. And the best platform to do this, but there were resolutions in 1965 and 1971 with regard to the ceasefire. And as recently as the 25th of April, you did have a presidential statement of the UN Security Council which spoke about the attack in Kashmir, etc. So it is to be expected that Pakistan will want an attack to take place, a terrorist attack. It will want India to retaliate so that the matter can be agitated at the international level and so that they can also raise the nuclear bogey to further, make the entire world apprehensive about what next. And they will continue to do that with a certain enthusiasm, in my view, because of this opportunity till the end of next year.
Right. Ambassador Chenoy, if I may, before bringing you to China, if I may just ask you a follow-up question of your previous answer to the first question. You talked about India-US defense relations and talked about purchases that we've made. These are obviously the ones that are in public domain. There may be many more other things. Do you think that the current standoff between India and the US, or US standoff against India, could change that part of our relationship, the India-US defense part of it, or will that stay intact?
From my point of view as head of India's largest defense and security think tank, I am of the view that that's not likely to be impacted. Because India and the United States have come a long way, as you said, in the last 25 years. All the foundational agreements have been put in place, including for information sharing. Me to mention, there is also an industrial security annex that was concluded. And so we are rock solid in that embrace. Short of an alliance partnership, everything else is in place. And the United States and India, between the two, have the highest number of, largest number of joint exercises, at least the largest that India has with any, the largest number that we have with any country is with the United States. And we are also a major defense partner. for the United States. We have been given SDA 1 status in terms of foreign military sales and things like that. So I don't think there is any sort of going back on that because in the long run, a robust India with robust military capabilities is in the interest of the United States, and I think even Trump will not be able to totally negate that logic. I think his focus is currently on issues like claiming credit for the ceasefire as a pathway to Nobel Peace Prize and also tariffs, which he thinks are the way to leverage the rest of the world and recast the US position and engagement with the rest of the world. So I'm quite confident that the defense cooperation will continue. We have special forces engaging with one another. There are other multilateral exercises in which we are involved, the Americans are involved, the Australians are involved, like DIA, Japan, some of the others may also be there. So all that is expected to continue. But I'm worried that the trust factor which has been affected by this may lead to a slowdown in terms of engagement on technology, especially. So that is of crucial importance to India as well. So if we can't get that right, then there could be a little stagnancy until the leadership changes or Trump changes his own view.
So I like to bring you to China. You've served in China in various capacities, and that was your first posting as well. And Chinese was your first compulsory language. Prime Minister Modi is expected, according to media report now, or sorry, 4 days from now, is going to obviously meet our foreign minister, meet the national security advisor, and several other persons. Do you think that this could be, this could kind of be the beginning of restoration of Sino-Indian relations post-Galwan? And if so, this is a slightly undiplomatic question, can China really be trusted?
So there's a bouquet of questions in what you just said. But let me say that India and China have a very complex relationship. And we've had many ups and downs since we gained independence in 1947 and the People's Republic of China was midwifed in 1949. And overnight, what were otherwise frontiers were suddenly being seen as borders, many sections of which were backed by treaties and things like that, and large sections were disputed as well. So we've had trouble right from day one with China. There was a phase of Hindi in the 1950s, and from there it went generally downhill. But we've had moments of expectation, points of inflection also. I recall being the desk officer for Rajiv Gandhi's visit in 1988, when we believed that a new beginning was being made in our relations, and there were two pillars for that visit in terms of the understanding reached. One was that we would put aside the very vexatious boundary dispute, continue to work on it, but maintain peace and tranquility, keep negotiating. On the other hand, we would not prevent the boundary question from coming in the way of expanding all-round engagement and relations with the People's Republic, including in the economic sphere. And that would be to mutual advantage. In hindsight, I would say that we've had fresh tensions, again, in a cyclical manner. The cycles keep getting shorter and sharper, but we seem to come out of these as direct to China. And we had made up. Thereafter, we saw 5 years of excellent, splendid bilateral trade and economic ties from around 2001 to 2006. So we've seen these ups and downs before. So the broad point that I would like to make today is that this is a triangle. There are 3 sides to it. We have relations with China, we have relations with the United States, and the both of them also have a very important relationship. Whenever India has had poor relations with China and the United States, the both of them have taken advantage of India. And this happened in the aftermath of our nuclear tests, when Clinton went to Beijing and Chiang Zemin and Clinton came out with a joint communique on South Asia, calling upon India and of course on Pakistan as well to, roll back their nuclear programs and to sign the NPT and the CTBT and all that. So if currently we have difficulties with the United States, it's logical, stands to reason that we should be taking advantage of the recent thaw in our relations with China to take things forward. And since last year, since October 23, the second front, not along the northern borders, but in Pakistan, in a layered manner. During Operation Sindoor, we were contending not only with Pakistan's capabilities, but also with China's capabilities, both, as Ajay said, offensive and defensive. So we've had this jolt, but I think the broad trajectory right now, notwithstanding that, is pointing towards a thaw. And the relationship that China has with Pakistan is not altogether new. It's not as if this is for the first time in our lives that we've discovered such collusion between them. They've always described their relationship as being as deep as the ocean and as high as the Himalayas. And with the North Koreans, they said it's as close as lips and teeth. So here the point is, we are aware of their close relations with Pakistan. No surprise there. And knowledge, nobody has succeeded in de-risking completely from China. Not the United States, not Japan, not Australia, not India, not the EU. Decoupling is only a chimera, it's fiction. But even de-risking has been difficult. That's why we still have trade. After Galwan, we have a huge amount of trade and adverse balance at that. So we have to look for these, nodes to connect, to engage, and to maintain stability. We can ill afford, lack of stability in all our major relationships. And I think Indian leadership and diplomacy is dexterous and fleet-footed enough to be able to do that in a timely manner. As for trust, I think you trust no one. Or what is it that, Reagan had said, was it Reagan? That trust but verify. But there are no permanent enemies. There are only permanent interests. I don't know if it's apocryphal, but it's attributed in the 19th century, the British Prime Minister. So we trust no, I recommend we don't trust anyone. Could I just add a little bit, with your indulgence? The Sino-Pak relationship has a long history, and it goes back to the 50s. And what is one of the most remarkable features of this relationship is that its genesis lies in the 1950s, when Pakistan was an active member of a treaty alliance partnership led by the United States, not one, but two. That is to say, CENTO and SEATO, the Baghdad Pact and the Manila Pact. And yet, the US was quite forgiving of Pakistan even then, that Pakistan was loath to or reluctant to actually do anything against Chinese interests. It was never really held to that particular responsibility. And as India-China relations deteriorated in the 1950s, late 50s, the Chinese and the Pakistanis came closer together, and particularly, effected a reset in their ties on the 2nd of March 1963, when Pakistan ceded 5,180 square kilometers of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir in the Shaksgam tract across the Karakoram to China. designed for their first atomic device was provided by China, and one of the first tests was carried out by China, proxy test in China for Pakistan.
In Lopnor.
So, in the Lopnor desert. So that's, no. Now, why does the United States want to get back into Pakistan? They too have a very old relationship. And there were moments when they were really thick, particularly when the Soviets were in Afghanistan. In the sort of counter-terrorism war on international terror, Pakistan has always been able to reinvent itself and come up like a savior to meet US interests. Most recently, they have turned in, I think, a scoundrel called Sharifullah, Aka Jafar, who was responsible. He is an ISIS-K operative who was responsible for the deaths of 13 US servicemen and 170 Afghans in the dying days of the US presence in Kabul, when a suicide attack was carried out at the Hamid Karzai International. It's a kind of interlocutor or intermediary, potential or otherwise, with China. It can also be used for outreach to Iran, to the Gulf countries, and to perform these counterterrorism functions. Why do the Chinese not object to the Americans coming in? Because they realize that they actually have the Pakistanis well in their camp. And this little bit of latitude actually creates a greater maneuvering space for the Chinese to be able to direct Pakistan in different directions in their own interactions with the United States against third parties, including against India.
Ambassador Chinoy, do you have anything, you want to add anything to this?
Well, all I would say is that, any deal that comes around as a result of either bilateral or trilateral negotiations between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky is likely to be to the detriment and disadvantage of Ukraine, because the territories in question have been legislated constitutionally to be now an integral part of the geography of the Russian Federation, such that even Russia's nuclear posture rests on that. Because Russia's nuclear posture speaks of resort to the nuclear option in the face of an existential threat. And an existential threat is linked to its territorial integrity, the geography of Russia as it exists today, with the inclusion of these, you might call them newly acquired territories. So any deal now or 10 days later or 6 months later is kind of going to be on Putin's terms, in my view. He has been around longer than anyone can remember, 1999 onwards. So he's one of the world's longest serving leaders. He has seen off, if I can use that term, many presidents, even those with 8-year terms, as in 2 terms. So he is not someone unfamiliar with the exercise of raw power by US presidents, which comes in flashes and spurts, in different deal. I'm not too sure. If it's not a very fair deal, one is also not sure of how long it will last. Now, it's not as if past presidents in the United States have not engaged in peacemaking. You may remember photographs of Arafat and Begin, isn't it, in United States in 1992, if I'm not mistaken. One of the first things that Clinton did was to broker that peace between the Arabs and the Israelis for West Asia. But if that had held, why would you have all the trouble you have today? So people have tried so many things. Camp David is known for these things in the US. So let's see how it goes.
If I may just come to the probably last couple of questions. Do you think that
we are paying the price of mistakes that were made, fundamental mistakes that were made by our first Prime Minister in the sense of Kashmir, in the sense of Tibet, our policy towards Tibet, our not ensuring that we get all of J&K back, which is our, which was a state that acceded to the Indian Union. Are we paying for those mistakes? Was it because they never understood geopolitics, they did not understand geography, or what?
As far as the early stage was concerned, let me put it this way. It's easy, of course, for us to take a more clinical view now. When people live in their own times, things appear to be far more complex. In the case of India, I would say that as far as the Korean War was concerned, from 1950 to 1953, India under Nehru wanted to play a role. We were to be the chairman of the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission. We were taking active interest in all this, and we couldn't have done that unless all the belligerents agreed to that role for India. That meant that you had to be acceptable to the People's Republic of China for India to play any kind of role in Korea in terms of playing the role of a peacemaker or promoting that kind of settlement there. So to some extent people say that our own national interests vis-a-vis China on difficult issues were brushed aside for sake of a larger role. Now there is some evidence to this effect. If you look at the old literature, when you will not discuss the boundary question with China. Now in 1954, it was already known that the boundary dispute was rearing its ugly head in certain parts, particularly in the middle sector. In the north of Chamoli, there is this disputed tract, meadow called Badahoti, and the Chinese were already probing in 1953 and early 54. And there was a fair idea that China was showing maps claiming large tracts of Indian territory. But the instructions to the Indian delegation were that do not discuss the boundary question. If the Chinese were to raise the boundary question, please disengage and come back. And so in the Panchsheel agreement, India also obviously did not discuss anything about the boundary, but India conceded that the Tibet region was a part of China. Now that settled the Tibet matter, because if in 1954 India took the view that Tibet region was a part of China, and we've conceded that, then obviously we are not going to be able to change that stand anytime soon. So later, of course, it became, Tibet region as an integral part of the People's Republic of China. Perfect Vision 2020. On Kashmir, for example, when the tribals and the Pakistan, aided and abetted by the Pakistani regulars, swarmed into, Maharaja Hari Singh's territory in 1947, it was also clear that it was a case of aggression. And so when Nehru took the matter to the United Nations, he had taken it as a question of aggression by Pakistan, regulars and irregulars. But at the second meeting of the Security Council, the agenda item was changed by the major powers, the great powers, to the India-Pakistan question, which really equated the victim with the aggressor. And that monkey has never left our back since then. There is no sunset clause on that agenda item. For that matter, there is no sunset clause on UNMOGIP, the UN observer mission for India and Pakistan, which is supposed to observe the ceasefire. We obviously do not give it any kind of credibility or support, which is why at the UN, when the Secretary General's report comes out on ceasefire violations, it invariably says 600, 800 violations by India. and 0 violations by Pakistan, because we do not obviously allow them to go and observe anything in the forward areas. So we can say that things could have been done differently with regard to Kashmir. We could have done something different that he engaged in by saying that these were old maps, that China had no chance to revise them. We should have taken it head on in the 50s. And Tibet, I think it's not really much of a card, frankly, because India has always recognized Tibet to be a part of China. And by the way, so have all the other great powers. The United States has never, ever questioned the territorial integrity of the People's Republic of China. So there you have it. None of the great powers have supported Tibet at the UN. I agree with Ajay on the first part that it's not true to say that the entire neighborhood first policy has proved unsuccessful. There are ups and downs, and the examples that he cited are right. I would also add that Nepal-India relations currently are quite stable under Prime Minister Oli, and may it long remain so. Now, as far as Operation Sindoor and the aftermath, in terms of the all-party delegations, etc., is concerned, I speak from personal experience because I was a member of one of the all-party delegations, and it's true that we did not go out there to get each one of them to shout from the rooftops that it was Pakistan that did it. We were there to tell them that it was Pakistan that did it. And it's also not true that there was no sort of support, because when we went to, for example, the UAE, we found that the highest, the DR Congo, Sierra Leone and Liberia, which were other countries in West Africa that we visited, and I'll tell you why we went to such countries, all the three observed moments of silence in their parliaments, in their upper houses, in their lower houses, and there was great success because in one fell swoop, we were able to get almost the entirety of their government, their think tanks, their journalists, their social media influencers, even the youth, the diaspora from, India, all of them on the same page. And that's much more effective than trying to do something long distance or trying to do it through your permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. So it was very, very effective. I remember Mr. Kapil Sibal invited me to go on to his show after that. He has a show called Dil Se. And he told me very frankly on the phone, his first question was, or observation was, that your trip was hopeless and wasn't successful, and because nobody condemned Pakistan openly. And I said, it wasn't that we wanted them to say that Pakistan's done this. We were there to tell them. Because these are countries that are either in the Security Council right now as non-permanent members, like in the case of, Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is also an OIC member state. But DR Congo and Liberia are incoming members of the UN Security Council and will be there for the next 2 years as Pakistan engages in more mischief or its machinations until the end of next year. You will have the likes of, Liberia and DR Congo also sitting there for 1 year alongside Pakistan. And so it's...
Okay, we'll just take the last question.
So my view of a stronger India is an India in which there is tremendous focus on economic growth. And this will happen alongside what you call peaceful borders, peace and stability, which will facilitate internal economic growth. Now, economic growth, in my view, should necessarily come for, the game is with the industry and manufacturing sector. That's where you can actually create employment opportunities also. The service sector doesn't employ as many as the manufacturing sector. So I'm not sure if we have actually missed all manufacturing waves. We may have missed the first one, we may have missed the second one, but there is still opportunity because nobody can beat the labor cost arbitrage that we have. And as behemoths like China move away from certain types of manufacturing because they are moving up the value chain and their costs are going up as well, this kind of manufacturing is shifting to our part of the world, but it's not without conducive to the MSMEs particularly. I think almost 40% of our exports come from the MSMEs. You can see how MSMEs are central to our exports to the United States as well. So policies have to be geared to encourage the MSMEs. And we don't have the large companies like China has or the chaebols of Korea. Our manufacturing is scattered. And so appropriate policies are required. These policies must be uniform across all states also. If this can be done, if labor and other laws can be improved, if we can create the supply chains for them to receive raw materials and to sell to markets appropriately, then there's no looking back.